Good morning, church. Years ago, Sugi and I could not sleep for several days out of fear. I was warned that I should be careful of some possible terror attacks. Once in Cardiff and elsewhere in Wales, there were some North Korean defectors. For the first time, I and the Korean church met the North Korean people. As in Korea, nobody is allowed to visit or communicate to the North. As a small Korean church, we were doing our best to support the North Korean families in need and also shared the gospel with them. Over years, some were saved and experienced God in miraculous ways by God's grace. Some of you might have seen us performing a concert and selling some handmade cards here to raise funds for them years ago. Because of my and the church's active involvement in the North Korean community and the Korean government-related work, I had an interview on the telephone with a Korean journalist regarding the life of the North Koreans here in Cardiff, and I agreed to broadcast the interview through a major television news program in Korea. However, after a half-hour interview, only one sentence of my talk was on TV. It was like this: the North Korean defectors should keep the rules of Britain in order to settle in the country well. This was right in the middle of my sympathetic account in the interview about their hard lives when abroad without any English and understanding of the culture. But the short part of the interview was used in another context, which was revealing the North Koreans' illegal conduct for survival in several countries. After that, I had a few complaints by email from North Korean asylums who were living in Korea. Also, one close North Korean friend in Cardiff came to me and said that some North Korean defectors in London and other places in the UK were thinking to harm me due to my interview. He warned me to be careful, as they were well trained in using knives and guns. After hearing it, Sugi and I completely lost our peace of mind. I had to lock all our doors again and again when I dropped my children to Thornhill Primary School. I had to check every side to see if there was someone strange. Sugi and I prayed and prayed and prayed, but couldn't help being scared and had several sleepless nights. During this difficult time, I had a question in my mind. God clearly called me to do this, but why do things seem to stand against me? I think the remnants of Israel in this passage would have the same question like me. They were faithful to give up their settled lives in Persia and come back to the ruins of Jerusalem. It was because they saw God's amazing miracle through King Cyrus, who commanded them to return to their home for the rebuilding of God's temple, which had already been foretold through God's prophets a long time ago. But just as soon as they had finished building the foundation of the temple, they began to face resistance and threats. In the end, they had to stop the building work. As the beginning of the rebuilding work was so dramatic, Stopping the work must have been so disappointing. They would have thought, God, where are you now? The resistance came from the locals, but in the beginning, the local people seemed to be willing to help. As you can see on the screen, they said, "Let us help you build." It had been only a short period for the Israelites to settle around Jerusalem. Even though Jerusalem was theirs or their parents' hometown, it must have been still new to them. If the residents in powerful positions supported them, it would be helpful, wouldn't it? Wouldn't the remnants think that it was God's continued help after his unbelievable intervention through King Cyrus? What was the leaders' reaction to the offer for the support? They said, no. It was not even a gentle or indirect no. It was a very strong no. The Israel leaders said, "You have no part with us. We alone will build it for the Lord, the God of Israel." The Israel leaders would have known that if they offended the surrounding people, the neighbors would become threats to the Israelites, because the people near Jerusalem were vested people there. It is not an exaggeration to say that the remnants of Judah and Benjamin started the war by saying no. Then why do you think the Israel leaders said no despite the possible problems? In their answer, there is a superficial reason. As you can see on the screen, the leaders said, "You have no part with us, as King Cyrus, the king of Persia, commanded us, not the surrounding people." But there was an ultimate reason. What was it? Let's go back to verse 1. The writer of the book of Ezra describes the locals as the enemies of Judah and Benjamin. From chapter 3, we can see that the Israelites already felt fearful when they built the altar. Even though the locals said they would help and had been worshiping God since their initial move to near Jerusalem by the king of Assyria, they were against the Israelites who were returning. Then who were they? And what was going on? To find who they are, we need some background knowledge. As you heard Alan in the first session, Israel was divided into two, the north and the south, like Korea. 10 tribes in the north were called the Kingdom of Israel, and the capital was Samaria, worshiping God. But it was not only God they worshipped. 2 Kings 17 on the screen says that the new tenants in Samaria worshipped the Lord, but they also served their own gods in accordance with the customs of their own nations. Christianity is only about one God. We can't tolerate other gods alongside our God. I pray that none of us agree that we can meet God in the end via all kinds of religions. Their beliefs may look similar to ours and inclusive than ours. But what God forbids firstly in our loving covenant with him was having no other gods before him. It is like one husband has only one wife, and one wife has only one husband if they truly love each other. The remnants said no, despite the possible opposition from the Samaritans, and regarded them even as the enemies of Judah and Benjamin. You would find lots of mentions in the New Testament that Jews hated and looked down on the Samaritans. It was because of this story of their syncretism, religious pluralism, interfaith, and ecumenical approach in their belief. The leaders did the right thing in the beginning. However, after this, as you can see on the screen, the enemies no longer hid their sharp claws and did their best to hinder the rebuilding work by threatening, telling lies to the authority, and bribing, etc., until the reign of King Darius. So the building work was stopped. It was completely stopped. Last Sunday, Alan taught us very well about the meaning of the rebuilding work. God and the people's effort for the rebuilding was not just about the stone building itself. The rebuilding of the temple meant restoring the relationship between God and his people, which was broken due to the people's betrayal and sins by rebuilding God's dwelling place. Restoring the covenant relationship between God and us is what God really wants, and at the same time, that is what the enemy Satan does not like at all. As Satan broke the relationship between God and Adam using a serpent in the Garden of Eden, the enemy was continuing his work here using the Samaritans until God restores the perfect covenant relationship in the true heavenly temple, which was shown as a copy in the stone building. The enemy will not stop. The enemy's work is repeated again and again in the Bible. It shows how the enemy persists in trying to break the rebuilding of the relationship between God and his people. Could you have a look at the screen, please? This is Ezra chapter 4, which has 3 parts in it: yellow, blue, and yellow. Firstly, the beginning of the chapter 4 was talking about the rebuilding work of the temple until verse 5. But certainly, the middle part is mentioning the rebuilding work of the city and the walls of Jerusalem. You can think that the story was written in chronological order. However, others say that these kings are them who reigned after Darius. They say that the writer of Ezra didn't give this account in chronological order and included the story which happened much later in Nehemiah's time. Do you know how long the temple work was stopped? Yes, it was for 16 years. It didn't need to be for such a long time. In the beginning, the leaders did well by saying a definite no to the enemies. But when the enemy powerfully continued to stop their work, some people in the community began to give up. In the book of Haggai, we see that God told Israel off for saying that it was not the time to rebuild yet, putting the priority on their own work, not God's work. I presume Stu might deal with this more next Sunday, so I won't go further here. In essence, it was a shame that the remnant had a good start, but were deceived or compromised to stop the work they had been called to do by poor discernment and wrong priorities. Let me conclude. We, as individuals and as a church, are still doing a rebuilding work in our own and church context. God called us to do it. However, let's remember that it is not going to be easy. The enemy won't stop. Are we disappointed at church life or with some people? Have we found keeping on serving the Lord difficult? Are we thinking, if there is God, why? Because of hardship, have we been set back from any kind of rebuilding work as God's church? However, we should remember from this story that it is unavoidable to have resistance and difficulties through people and circumstances, as the people of God before us had already experienced. Going back to my story in the beginning, when I served the North Korean defectors, there were lots of happy moments, seeing them settled here and to be friends of us as fellow Christians. But to be honest, there were a lot of hard times as well. We were using the same language, but there were a lot to learn to understand them. What happened because of the interview was solved after 3 sleepless nights. During a prayer on the 3rd night, the Spirit revealed that it was just a lie and a blackmailing which was made up by the person who had told me to be careful. He must not have liked me telling him to keep the rules. I sensed that if I stopped nagging him, nothing would happen. As you can see, I'm okay. I'm still alive, and our families are okay. I think it was partly my fault and immaturity. But at the same time, it was one of the scariest attacks in my ministries, which could have made me stop that ministry. Looking back on my life, I had many threats and attacks serving the Lord, and to my regret, there were several setbacks. Satan is always waiting for an opportunity to lock us down. He does not reveal his existence in obvious ways. He can disguise himself as a bright angel. Satan's attack could come from people who look like one of us and are worshiping God, but worshiping other things as well. Many times, he can use one of us, including me, to fail you. As Apostle Peter was used by Satan for trying to stop Jesus from taking the cross. However, let's not give up. That is what the enemy wants us to do. Let's not allow any compromise through poor discernment. When God's direction is clear and he proves it with many confirmations, even though it is hard, we should not draw back. Let's not waste our precious time. God does not accept half-hearted obedience. Let me pray. Lord, I pray for me to keep going despite the resistance. I pray for us, Thornhill Church, to keep going despite the opposition from the enemy. Lord, Help us, Lord, protect us from the enemies. Amen.